Welcome to the Broken Lens Podcast. This is Adam Stutz.
And I'm Heather Watson.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Yeah, things are good. How about you? I think you've had a more eventful weeks than I have.
Yeah, our poor puppy got spayed, and so it's been a bit rough for her, and so we've been kind of dealing with the fallout from that. And she's a trooper, and she's starting to feel better, which is great for her. Not so good for us. So there's a lot of bad behavior that we're having to deal with right now.
Yeah.
So
It'll be better in the long run.
yes, spaying is important, especially for the longevity of a dog and for her overall health and well-being.
Oh, I didn't know that. It
Yeah.
actually helps them health-wise.
Yeah, it's a preventative thing that can prevent them from having cancer and also essentially like doggy breast cancer as well, and other kind of like things that can affect their lifespan. So it does in fact like increase their lifespan.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah. And then in other news, I went to see the Canadian singer-songwriter Andy Schaaf over at the Pico Union Project. It was awesome. If you've never been to the Pico Union Project, it's like I believe it was a synagogue. I don't believe it's in use anymore, but I'm not positive. But it's beautiful inside. It's got incredible stained glass windows and this just gorgeous organ. It's a two-story organ, and they have this really beautiful lighting, so it's very dramatic. And it was just Andy Schaaf and him on guitar singing kind of a variety of songs from different albums, and it was absolutely wonderful. It's my third time seeing him, so
I was just about to ask. I knew it had been a couple at least.
I have a long-standing obsession with the music of Andy Schaaf. It got me through a lot of difficult points through the pandemic, and in fact, he was the last show that I went to before everything shut down.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
fun.
So for this week, we had Juleen Eun Sun Johnson and Eliot Cardinaux, and I had great conversations with both of them. Juleen, we talked a lot about her lyricism. I talked about how she utilizes like empty space in a lot of her poems, and also about her experience growing up in Alaska, having been adopted when she was 3 from South Korea, and how those things play an important role in like her, perception of place and how that ties into a lot of her writing. And then we had an interesting kind of conversation about the yeah, yeah, yeahs at the end of our interview too, which was pretty cool. And then Eliot was also a wonderful interview. For our listeners, Eliot is a jazz pianist, improvised musician, or improvisational musician, I should say, in addition to being a poet. He and I talked a lot about the influence of improvisational music on his writing. We talked about his connection to the concept of divinity and the universe at large. I, really appreciate the musicality of both of these writers. I think they have excellent execution when it comes to, their lines, and I'm very curious to see, more of their work out in the world. I know Eliot has a new book out. Juleen also has a chapbook out, Topography of Materials. For our listeners, we'll put links to those publications in the show notes, and if you have an opportunity to go check them out, please do. They're both exceptional writers, and we're really happy to have had the opportunity to publish them.
I thought it was really interesting. There were a lot of parallels between both of these authors in ways that, like, specifically what struck me was that they both have sort of artistic backgrounds in addition to being poets. So they're both, artists, musicians, that kind of thing. And you talked to both of them about how that practice influences their writing or not. And both of them had different answers, like pretty distinct perspectives on it. And I thought that was a really interesting parallel. And then also you were talking to both of them about, like you said with Juleen, like the sense of place, since they both sort of have, mixed backgrounds in one way or another. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting sort of through line with both of these interviews. So I think our listeners will take interest in that perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I hope that our listeners enjoy our interviews. Here are my interviews with Juleen Eun Sun Johnson and Eliot Cardinaux. Juleen Eun Sun Johnson, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'd like to have you start by reading Car Engine from issue 5.
Car engine. The universe came in the form of a blue jay flying into view. Jasmine blossoms, night, fertilized darkness, waiting for rainfall. Unseen music came from, can you smell it? His identity sweet. A candidate for the lost pear apple found. Touch breeze. Split ripe to the ground. Youths fumble from both limb to bough. Impulse to destroy the world arrives, grounded endlessly. Milking milkweeds, an attempt to keep going around and around.
When I read your work, I'm drawn to the precision of your lines and the intensity of the language. I feel like your lyricism, it's compact and kinetic. For example, when reading and then listening to Car Engine, each stanza unfolds like a piston moving up and down during like turning a crankshaft. And there are also these like microcosms that are operating in each stanza that could be treated as separate poems. And yet there's this continuity of life and death, ignition and extinguishment, and each stanza exerts this wonderful tension between these opposing forces. And I'm wondering, like, while you write poems, with longer lines, what is it that draws you to writing some of these short lyrics? And what is it about a shorter line that you feel may be more effective in certain poems versus a longer line, and vice versa?
Well, when I was studying at Iowa, I was studying with Mark Lagner, and he had us use shorter and lines, and then had each one of those little stanzas be a poem, but then had us write 12 of them and have had them connected to each other. And I always thought that that was a great method to writing a poem, when you are doing it at a time in which you should be doing other things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's just like a quick turnaround and a quick way to play with language, where your concentration is broken for a second, and then so I think each line is, or each stanza in that poem is connected by that tissue of time.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Mm-hmm.
little increments of time where you're seeing something and you have to grasp it really fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it also reminds me of some of the work of Sid Corman, and how there's this, they're both like an ephemeral quality, but there's like that kinetic quality. There's the grasping of, as you put it, like kind of that language in, spare moments when you should be focusing your attention on something other than what you're doing with the writing. And I noticed for myself, and this is probably not a great thing, but like when I'm driving, for example, is typically when things will kind of jump out at me. And so obviously it's not a safe time to jot something down, but I will end up recording myself, just kind of with the line. Whether or not I use it later, it's a whole other story. But But I find that there is something about the way that those kind of excerpts from these different kind of disparate moments and stuff will kind of unfold and then can be woven back together to create this really interesting tapestry. And that's something that I really like about the work that you do, is that there's also a laddered quality to it that I like, as though each one is a step or a stepping stone into the next lyric. And so that's where this kind of kinetic energy like comes from. And I really appreciate that.
It's all about play, right? Like we have to have this sense of play as writers in order, or any kind of creative, like in music and in writing and in making movies, film,
Mm-hmm.
plays. You have to have this sense of play and wonderment in order to keep wanting to write. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes these moments where you're all like, oh, I can just sneak a little word in here, or it's kind
Yeah.
of that formal quality that is so informal at that
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps me driven, is by like
Yeah.
this play, when it's like an inopportune time, but it's also like the right time.
Yeah, I know for myself when I have conversations with anyone, because of my neurodivergence, constantly have to deal with like interjections in my thought patterns, and it can completely derail conversations depending on like the circumstances in which I'm having a discussion. And so I think that I like that idea, just kind of like that tension between almost like the formal and the informal, and those the way those interjections work. You also utilize empty space in a really effective way in your poems. And, I'm partial to the use of empty space in my writing, and I believe it's just as effective a tool as, say, in Jammin, alliteration, etc. For me, the emptiness takes on a life of its own. Like if you think about, the negative space in between a building when looking at the sky, there's like a whole other invisible architecture that emerges from the space. And I feel like you use it very effectively. And I was just wondering, how do you think empty space functions in your poems? Do you think that empty space is something that's also underutilized in poetry these days?
I have a background in art,
Mm-hmm.
and so I may be going off topic right now, but I started off in the dark room as
Mm-hmm.
a black and white photographer, learning how to frame and like frame images
Mm-hmm.
into a certain amount of space. And so I'm utilizing the space in the poem as kind of like that black and white space, as I would have in the dark room,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or as a compositional was the word I was looking
Yeah.
for. Yeah, compositionally, I'm kind of thinking of a poem as in an artistic way
Mm-hmm.
as well. And I find that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So
Mm-hmm.
I've been really trying to be mindful of when it isn't working, when it is.
Mm-hmm. I find that I like open formatting and kind of creating broad, visually interesting poems. And I like it because I feel like it affords me a certain freedom to move things in a way and create kind of combinations of words and phrases that might otherwise be limited if I were sticking to, just a left margin, very lineated, like just writing in quatrains or something like that, and instead giving myself the ability to like kind of move pieces around as though it were either a puzzle or a collage. And I feel like that's something that I really appreciate about like surreal work. And it's great that you mentioned your background as a visual artist too, because I also love your abstract paintings. They're really beautiful, and in terms of like the colors that you use, and again they're very kinetic. And it's interesting to think about those paintings versus, say, the stanzas in Car Engine, which have very concrete, a lot of them have very concrete images, but then you think of like the way that you're using paint and how it moves across the canvas. And I like those juxtapositions, and I'm wondering, how does one influence the other for you? You talked about, photography and how that framing and composition stuff influence maybe like how you look at like kind of the format of your poem, but then how does the medium of painting also influence your work?
Well, actually, this is also going off topic. I'm so sorry. So I started off as a music major,
Mm,
and then poetry. Well, poetry, music, poetry. Then I was done with my poetry bachelor's, and I went and got an art bachelor's degree because of the dark room.
mm-hmm,
And then I went to Mass MoCA
mm-hmm.
for the residency there, and I had four studios. Well, four
Oh,
studios were open because there were three of us there. So in one room I did installation, one room I did performance, one room I did painting.
oh wow.
And so I think it all just speaks to each other.
Like synthesization
Yeah.
in a way, yeah.
Yeah, and so usually what I'll do is I'll go to my writing studio in the morning, and then I'll come home and I'll go to my art studio, and I'll do sketches to kind of mediate,
Mm-hmm.
like 5 minute sketches, and then I'll go into painting or whatever I'm going to be doing in the studio. So it has that cleansing.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Like, okay,
Yeah,
I'm not working with words anymore. I'm going to be doing this.
yeah. But then I could also see if you're having that moment where you're having this more, kind of visceral relationship to your medium, and then there could be some of the lingering effects of like having that visceral activity, that physical activity and stuff of like the painting or whatever you might be working on in the afternoon, that carrying over back over into the morning. And so there's this kind of cyclical thing that's happening. And to your point about the writing practice feeding into the art some, but then like the art feeding back into the writing practice, that's really cool. I was wondering if you could read Flames Went Off in a Photograph.
Yeah, and this is to Stephanie, which we talked about in a flames went off in a photograph. Time, space, a mirror, time stood only in a photograph. Birds beat time, music shares, last chances. Chances begin again. Candles hold keys to something strange. Shall we forget yesterday? Whisper nothing to time, because space will not save permanence from some damn street. You have been down that street before. In mere shadows, when time stood still in some damn photograph, burning. Kira's private beach under Bixby Bridge, a Volkswagen bug stuck in the sand, rusted with ocean mist in someone else's hourglass.
I love how that poem unfolds. I think it does a great job of invoking kind of what we were talking about in terms of that synthesization, and it's a beautiful poem. You mention in your bio that you were born in Seoul, adopted when you were 3, and grew up in Valdez, Alaska. And I was wondering how you feel your sense of place affects your writing. And then on the contrary, do you feel like a sense of displacement also features in your writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm always grappling with all of these kind of emotions, but also ways of looking at it. Like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I do sometimes feel displaced, well, all the time because, Alaska, it wasn't the easiest place to grow up
Mm-hmm.
at being a person of color. And
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm not trying to say bad things or anything
Oh
because
no.
I enjoyed my time living there. I mean, if I didn't live there, I probably wouldn't be writing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually know. So, I think some things happen for a reason, right? Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I ended up there for a reason. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, this poem means a lot to me because of Stephanie. And yeah, there's a lot to say about that. It's weird because when I was 35, we went back to Korea, and I don't know if I feel more displaced now than I
Hmm.
did before we went back. We meaning my husband and I.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think I could have done it by myself. So it was really nice to have him be with me and going through all of the pain of going back. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I answered your question, because it's really complicated. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's so many layers, and sometimes it feels not complicated, and sometimes it feels like it is complicated.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like going back and forth with writing and art. Like it's complicated. Like, do I want to be an artist or do I want to be a writer? And like
Right.
do both of them. And yeah.
I could see where we get into the, kind of going back and forth between those two poles. And as you were talking, it reminded me of kind of like my journey, I guess, with like grief after my mom had died back in 2011. And there is just, if I were to like map out how that worked and stuff, I mean, it's a kind of like personal epic in a way and stuff of like having to like process like how those emotions move and how it manifests in the things that I produce as a poet. And so yeah, I think that thinking about it relative to how our emotions kind of like manifest and stuff in these different ways, I could see, that also is reflected in that tension between different mediums and how it will evolve and, kind of emanate from the different work. And the fact that when you speak of these crucial points in your life, how the emotions, they move and undulate in the same way that, like a lot of your writing does. There's also like a water-like quality to it, and I think it's very evocative of journey. I mean, it is, it's how we moved for, thousands of years. And so it's something that I think is really important and very beautiful. And I think your work captures that very, very well. So another question that I enjoy asking my guests is, do you find yourself returning to certain forms, perhaps to relieve mental blocks? For me, it's pantoums are the thing that I like to write to kind of get my you know juices flowing again. Are there certain forms that you like to return to, or are there certain forms that you like to invert or deconstruct? And do what are those forms? Like, what are the things that you like to utilize?
Well, I use the sonnet a lot, and usually it's not romantic. Like they're how sonnets are supposed to be kind of like these, usually it's death and destruction. So I'm using it to kind of in the opposite way in which
Mm-hmm.
it's intended. So yeah, that's a form that I like to come back to. And couplets.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Yeah. It's interesting to Josh Charles, when I interviewed her, the work that we featured are sonnets that she wrote. And I always like also to think about like Ted Berrigan's sonnets. I like how he approached the sonnet. I feel like everyone has this idea about sonnets, being Shakespearean sonnets, Petrarchan sonnets. It has a very restrictive construction. And I like the deconstruction that happens and being able to kind of like revise and rewrite that, maybe those limitations, those constraints. That's really cool. I like that. In addition to being a poet and a scholar, you're also, as we were talking about, founding editor of Trestle Ties, Landscape of Emergence, and you were a special features editor for Jubilat. How do you feel your writing has been shaped by your experience as an editor? And then, on the flip side, like how has your work as a writer influenced your editorial work?
I feel like reading other people's poems is kind of an outlet, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you're not just like we were talking a little bit about editing and how sometimes you get in your own way. Well, when you're looking at other people's works and you're like, oh, how are other people looking at my work? Or, how am I going to be learning from this person's poem? So it's kind of a two-way street because you're not only reading and dissecting someone else's work, but then you're also going, oh, it's like someone else is doing this exact same thing with my work.
Mm-hmm.
And, you want to give your attention to that person's work because,
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't have been submitting if they didn't want to be a part of the publishing.
Yeah. I find that like oftentimes my surprise and my joy at receiving certain types of work and then being like, you know, feel, having moments of like envy almost sometimes when you come across someone who just writes something so beautiful and devastating and you're like, oh, I wish I could have written that, but at the same time, it's great to be able to give a platform to it for me and for my craft. I'm able to then go back and start, applying that same kind of level of, I need to really be mindful of the details that I'm looking at and everything. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Sometimes it makes you overanalyze. Like
Yeah.
we were talking about earlier. I don't know, you could sometimes have to step away and just be like,
Hmm.
okay, like everything is different. Like
Absolutely.
it's hard to
Absolutely.
explain how the feeling is or how you interpret it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I'd like to now have you read Rings.
Rings. Leaves cannot measure rain, but trees can with rings. Ring is infinity. A wedding in the summer rain, a funeral in the bitter winter.
Between like Car Engine and Rings, and I mean, just the poems that we published, I love how Car Engine and Rings, they're like bookends in some ways. And your work just has this, it's conversational, but it's also, compact. There's aphoristic qualities to it. You have so much great stuff going on at the same time. I love how there's just this wonderful spectrum that is present in your poetry, and I'm really glad that we were able to share some of it with our readership. And I hope that our readers will be able to go back out and find more of your work online. I did want to ask one question. You had selected Burning by the Yeah Yeah Yeahs for our playlist.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know why that song, and does that song have any importance to you writing wise? Like what is it about that song that you love?
So in 2010, I really wanted to see them
Hmm.
live, and we didn't. So for my birthday last year, my husband got us tickets to go see them. And well, at that point, this book was already pretty much done. Like
Hmm.
we knew which poems were going to be in it. And
Yeah.
that song just resonated because, well, I may be like putting context into it, but I just thought it was about like the world,
Yeah.
all of these bad things happening, and I was just like, oh, well, it kind of relates to this book, and so
Yeah.
that's what, and some of the poems, and that's why I chose it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm a big Yeah Yeah Yeahs fan. Carano is definitely a celebrity crush for me. So, so
Well, the crazy thing, so we were waiting in line, and I don't know if you've read Crying in H Mart.
no, not yet. But Japanese Breakfast is also an
Yeah.
amazing, amazing, yeah, artist.
So we were waiting in line because we got there at 10 o'clock in the morning because we wanted to be right
Oh
there in the
wow.
front.
Yeah.
So we had our lawn chairs and water, and I was reading the book, and she mentioned Karen O, and I was just like, wait a minute, Karen O is half Korean? And my husband looked at me like, you didn't know that? I was like, no, I just found that out reading the book. And so I'm reading the book, and like as the line is moving, because we were sitting there for like 8 hours. So as the
Mm-hmm.
line was moving, I'm like bawling my eyes out
Oh,
because it's such a sad book. It just like
yeah.
me. I was like, don't look at me. Because I wasn't crying. I wasn't crying because I was excited to go. Well, I mean, I was
Yeah.
excited to go see them, but I was crying because of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that was when I found out Cardinaux was half Korean. So so if anyone out there doesn't know that, now you do.
That's it. That's a great way to find out. What a great thing to have such a beautiful book as an inflection point, too. Can you tell our listeners where to find you online and also to find your book, Topography of Materials?
So you can find me at juleenj.com. And if you'd like, you can also submit to Trestle Ties. And
Yes.
you can find my book through me or through my publisher, Bottle Cat Press.
Awesome.
Yeah, which is also in LA.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
they are.
Craig has been so amazing to work with. He's been so supportive because I'd never been published before, and so he kind of like held my hand through the
Yeah.
whole process. And I felt so bad for him because I was just like, "What's happening?" And but he was so nice and genuine guy. Yeah,
Yeah. It's great to have people exemplify how to conduct yourself like an editor. I very much have had that experience with my editor as well. And so I completely agree. Well, Julian, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. And I know our listeners will greatly appreciate being able to listen to you. And we look forward to speaking with you again at some point in the future.
yeah. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of your team for putting this together as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
All right, Julian, we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Eliot Cardinaux, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. I'd like to have you start by reading Seattle Night Prayer.
The price of the tacos will go unnamed. The alley bodies in prayer and their simple sanity. Love in the eyes of a woman in a lavender shawl, all around her the world and its infinite friendships. The outside seething with complex orations. The earth in its language surrounding a timid brain. A ceiling draped in white plastic wisteria. A candle on every table. I listened to a man rant out his shift. Every one of his apologies refused absolutely.
Thank you. That's gorgeous. I love the disparate elements in this poem, but how they assemble into this beautiful tableau that vibrates and shimmers. And lines like the alley bodies in prayer and their simple sanity create this gorgeous and harrowing image of holy suffering and give this saintliness to the invisible. Your collective work feels as though it's attempting a dialogue with the divine. And there are also elements that evoke, the work of Sid Corman for me, whose own work engaged with the idea of benediction and divinity, often using short aphoristic poems to great effect. I also have an affinity for aphoristic poems that condense energy into small spaces. I also think of the work of Ilya Kaminsky, whose own work engages with the divine, and when he reads it, has a religious rhythm to how he reads it. It's like he's calling people to prayer, and it's beautiful. And I guess to start our conversation, how would you describe your work and how it engages with divinity? I know that's a big question, but I'm kind of thinking about it. How do you engage with divinity through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really I won't say obsessed with Tarkovsky for the past 3 or 4 years, but Andrei Rublev and this the notion in that film that the artist is not working in a vacuum, that the artist is not working in absolute solitude, in secluded from the world. In fact, the artist by necessity works within the world and with all that it entails, be it
Hmm.
suffering witnessed or suffering endured. I think for me, this notion of being an artist, from early on was sort of I won't say plagued, but maybe plagued by these notions of genius and masterpiece and masterwork. And I was never one of these people to whom things came relatively easy. I think in music, I remember Bill Evans saying something like, I had to work for 20 years before I could really do what I was trying to do. And I think there's this notion of, that work being not only technical, but also being somewhat spiritual in terms of using the work to go into experience and to invite into experience a reader, but also as a means of moving through experience. I think like my work, you said my collected work. I mean, I only have one full length collection published, but I'm working on other collections. I think I have about three that are sort of sitting finished, waiting for a home, or maybe I'll try to publish one of them eventually on my own. It's always a difficult thing, uh, the submissions and all that, and the poetry business. I'm not sure we can call it a business. I don't know. I guess we have to in a way. But yeah, I think there's this notion of a thread, which I also kind of, I would say, align with Michael Palmer, who titled one of his collections Thread.
Hmm.
I think with him, it's often more disparate elements coming together and being threaded together. The game of blind man's bluff with the history of poetry or history and poetry. But I guess in my case, it's kind of like threading through these experiences. We all went through COVID that felt sort of like the end of the world. And I think we're living in times where the end of the world is upon us. It's like
Hmm.
we're living in it. And so why write poetry? And so I think that coming back to the initial question, the divine being this urge, this need almost to confront things as they are, and not just a realism, but a sort of how do you say, like really looking at the thing, not turning away. I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm also reading a book by Patrick Pritchett, who's a great poet.
Hmm.
If you're not familiar, he wrote a book called Burn, which is the doxology of Joan of Arc.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's really been, profound to read it because I find so much kinship. And I never really thought of myself as a religious person per se. I'm not super bound to monotheistic thinking, nor am I bound to Buddhism. I don't know, but I feel like this notion of not just endurance, but also endurance in the face of witness,
Hmm.
like to not look away. I think that's a big part
Hmm.
of it for me, what my poetics is coming to terms with. And I think Ilya Kaminsky, like Deaf Republic, was a real game changer for me in how I saw that his thinking was sort of panning out on the page in a form of narrative. Like the book made sense. It was sort of almost like a play.
Hmm.
And I think I find him using his own experience in there. I know
Hmm.
his disability, but also, his history, his past, his
Hmm.
family history, and where he comes from,
Hmm.
all in there. And I think that takes place in my poetry as well. And I
Yeah.
don't want to say it's not narrative poetry necessarily. Sometimes there might be a narrative poem in there.
Hmm.
There are elements of narrative, but I think there's also this element of a narrative that if I look at Coltrane, whose life had a trajectory, that I'm looking for that momentum and direction and
Hmm.
seeking. I'm seeking in a way rather than knowing who I am and executing each poem. Uh,
Absolutely. For me, there's also deceptive effortlessness in your work. For me, your poems are very complex, but because you have a facility with language and kind of writing into these, at least insofar as like the work we published in this issue, writing into small spaces, the writing is also very approachable, and there's an incredible deftness that you have with capturing quiet. I imagine the lines being composed kind of in transit in various spaces where, you know, profundity can kind of show up in these very banal moments. And I guess I wonder, like, when composing your poems, do you find yourself starting, with form in mind and then driving towards more improvisational modes, or vice versa?
I think it's sort of a mix. I don't know that I don't really have a method.
Hmm.
I think what you said about poems being composed in transit is very real to me. Like I write a lot on my phone. That's mostly where I'm writing because I find it's very convenient to have it all stored somewhere. And I also find it helpful to see what it's going to look like when it's on a.
Mm-hmm.
I think the formatting for me is also strangely important that the form of a poem is also a shape on the page.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like Seattle Night Prayer is a prose poem, and I think the punctuation doesn't really act as line breaks, but there are line breaks in
Mm-hmm.
prose. So like the formatting on the page, like where I measure the drag on the right hand side, if it's justified or not justified. I mean, I think those are all kind of ongoing processes
Mm-hmm.
along with the composition itself. But I think the idea is that I have something to write. I like
Mm-hmm.
there's a sort of an urge, like I said, or a need to write, and then it's sort of like it's there, and I can breathe a sigh of relief, and then I work through it again. And I think like Mandelstam, or said Mandelstam is a big influence on my work, and he would say, I think, or actually it was Nadezhda Mandelstam in her memoir of their time in Stalinist Russia and then spent in exile, where she said, yeah, there was a sigh after the poem came onto the page, and then there was a sigh of relief when it all clicked together. So those
Mm-hmm.
are kind of like, I know that I have to write something, and then I know that I have to find its shape, or
Mm-hmm.
so there's two things going on. But I think sometimes the form is more like a result of content in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
really, or Charles Olson would have thought. I think that there's an inherent formal quality
Mm-hmm.
in that sort of long form narrative thing. So I also don't really think of the poems each on their own. I think of the poems as part of uh, a longer moment
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in time. And then the next section is a longer moment. I make a lot of chapbooks, and they're sort of like rough drafts, maybe for sections of a full length manuscript. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's my drafting process. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, and I like that you invoke Olson and obviously his essay on projectivism and how the breath and the body play a role in crafting the shape of a poem, how it influences punctuation and where the break happens, and that's something that I think has also played a big role in my own work. Clark Coolidge is also another really important, like, integral poet for how I approach writing. I do wonder, like, for you, like, if writing kind of shorter, more aphoristic poems is a more effective method of kind of creating the conditions for transcendent conversation. There is also kind of like thinking of Seattle Night Prayer, the Buddhist koan, and feeling that kind of shape to it. And I wonder if as opposed to say maybe something like Ilya's work, where there is a momentum that just kind of starts and then it feels trance like. There's that kind of aspect to it. And so I wonder for you if maybe there's something that's more attractive about that, like kind of the shorter aphoristic qualities.
Yeah, I tend to need to absorb a certain experience sometimes, and to do it, yeah, I don't know. I think maybe I work on a smaller scale because it allows me to explore that smaller scale in much more depth. I think
Mm-hmm.
like when I think of a longer work, I'm also thinking of each poem. I don't know. I mean, I'm still kind of working on my understanding of this, but how Jack Spicer talks about my early poems were one night stands, and then my later poems, like they all resonate together in the book. I think I'm still sort of geared toward this idea that it's some kind of personal narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my teacher at New England Conservatory, Anthony Coleman, the pianist who worked with John Zorn a lot, he would say something like, I just can't get rid of the hero.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to suggest my persona as some kind of a, but it's like, like I think we all have that element, especially living in this day and age where, and I just I can't avoid the question of social media and whether the attention span of a reader or the fact that I post a lot of poems on Instagram has something to do with it. I can't
Mm,
avoid that question. I mean,
hmm.
can I say that it's a simple answer? I'm not sure because that affects me too.
Right.
And I do spend a lot of time reading when I'm in a stable enough place to really focus on that. I don't know. I mean, I would say I've been working on sometimes threading some of those shorter aphoristic poems together into something longer
Hmm.
where it feels like it needs to be longer. It feels like it needs to take a period of time and work it through. And what I mean is, most of my poems appear typically in chronological order in my
Mm,
books. And so there is that sense of narrative for me. I can't tell if anybody else sees that, but I don't know what it is. It's like a desire for me to have something to hold on to in my
hmm.
life
Hmm.
that is my own. I think often as artists, and maybe I won't say especially poets, but I mean, there's so little money in what we do
Hmm.
that we often have to put on totally different hats or masks to sustain our living. And I have no problem working a day job, but for me, it's like uh, this is my secret melody.
Hmm.
As Matt Maneri would say, like I carry this around, I carry the work with me. I think that's when it becomes hard is when you can't find a publisher and it does become kind of a
Yeah.
weight, like you're carrying this stuff
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, and I think going back to the kind of point that you were making about the fact that these shorter works often feed into it's a longer arc that is
Yeah,
occurring, and I think that for myself as a reader, one of the things I love about these shorter aphoristic works is then piecing them together in this kind of broader construction, and seeing this as like them being these elements in a much more complex chain of events that not only elucidate parts of the poet's life but also allow us to see this like kind of like broader picture. It's a bit of a trite analogy, but like, the idea of getting very close to like a painting and stuff and seeing the elements and like those smaller microscopic parts and then being able to back out and then seeing kind of the larger picture. And I think that that's something that I appreciate about the smaller individual pieces and stuff, and then like where they fit in these larger schemes. I definitely can appreciate that. I'd like to have you read Seward Park.
Seward Park. Drove by a wedding the other day. Am I allowed the inflection as estimate? The Pacific Northwest is east of the rising sun, broken in the way I believe I know.
Mm, beautiful. In addition to being a poet, you're also a renowned pianist, a composer, recording artist. Can you describe for our listeners how improvisational music has played a role or not in your poetry and vice versa?
Absolutely. I think I was working on a manuscript that maybe will be coming out soon. I might be self-publishing it. It's called Quiet Labor, and it was dedicated to a friend of mine and very close musical ally and collaborator since I was about 15 years old, who passed away a little over 2 years ago.
Mm,
Um, and the book is kind of an elegy. It sort of braids two losses together. I'd also separated with a partner of 7 years during the
mm,
time that I was writing it. It was kind of like throughout this period leading up to the loss and then precipitating the loss. And so I was very focused on grief and uh, separation and all the stuff that went along with these losses. And the person who was looking at my book to try to help me to edit it, her name is Ivy Schweitzer. She's a retired professor from Dartmouth. She teaches women and gender studies, I think, and English literature and poetry. She said, "Well, you really need to say something about music if you're going to write an introduction. Your friend is musical." And sometimes I don't I don't think of the two happening in conjunction. Like it's just the two worlds are different. So when I'm a poet, I'm dealing with often other poets, and improvised music is not, it's not sort of your everyday lunch meal, so to speak. I don't know. That's a bit of a weird way to put it. And then when I'm hanging with musicians, sure, I have lots of musician friends who read poetry, but it's a different thing when you're on the level of creating it. So I think it's an important question, and I appreciate it. I think like then what my friend and editor Ivy Schweitzer said was, there's music all over this book, which I didn't, I never really thought about it in that sense. I think there's all kinds of musical phrases and this notion that the word becomes music, that I guess it's like another early mentor of mine was Ruth Lepson, Boston poet who was the poet in residence at New England Conservatory when I finished my undergrad there. And she talked about, well, poetry is sound and sense coming together. And so I kind of felt like, well, that makes sense to me, because I think when I used to play only improvised music or jazz, I always felt I want language in there. There's in fact, the same friend who passed away, he and another friend of ours started writing songs when we were undergraduates at Manhattan School of Music. Just when we were like 18 or 19, we were studying jazz, and it was like, okay, we're going to write songs now. They had been on a road trip across the States. We took a semester abroad in Amsterdam, and suddenly these guys they were like on the California Grateful Dead, like they were Rolling Stones. And I was sitting here like, I need to learn piano technique and study, what the first chord in the overture to Tristan and Isolde is. Is it a minor sixth chord? Is it a half diminished chord? And they were just laughing at me. And so it was like this notion, I know I had to figure out what this is and what they're stepping in. And I smelled it right away. It was like, I don't know this, this is not my world. So I think that's when I started writing lyrics, and I tried to be a songwriter. Sometimes I set one of my poems to a melody, or I definitely recite poems in music, but I'm not a songwriter. Not in the sense of like a singer-songwriter. It's just not, that's not the world I came up in. Much more in jazz, and then later free improvisation, and some classical too. And I love songwriters. I'm a big fan of Neil Young. Anyway, but I think the notion for me that the lyric poem also stems from the lyric, it's like there's always some convergence of music and poetry from dating way back, at least as far as I know, to the Greeks. I'm sure the Egyptians had something going on like that, and maybe the Incas and all these non-Western cultures that Western society and culture has tended to erase. But I think this notion that those two were intertwined was irking me more than anything, and I didn't know how to write words, and so I started writing poetry. I didn't have any idea what poetry was. I was trained in music, and then I just started reading everything. And I was living with my parents after I left New York. I mean, I had gone through somewhat of a mental break. And one of the things that I was doing, besides being in therapy and learning to kind of articulate what it was I was going through emotionally, which was very formative for me later as a writer, but also I would just sit in the basement, when I had time, and do this thing called writing poetry. I don't think I knew what it was, but as I discovered Mandelstam and Paul Celan and Ezra Pound. I mean, I think my teacher Peter Gizzi said Pound was my gateway drug, and we all know about Pound, and it's come at a bitter cost, for many poets, like waking up to the fact of who he was, and it still bears not to be censored or erased, because it teaches us an important lesson, I think, about aligning ourselves with some authority or system. But I read a lot, and then I think it didn't occur to me that the poetry and the music would go together until I recorded my first album as a leader. And I asked the drummer, it was a close friend of mine, Flynn Van Hemmen. this is my album American Thicket, which featured Matt Maneri on viola
Hmm.
and Thomas Morgan on bass, and then Flynn Von Hemmen was on drums. And I asked Flynn, "What do you think? I mean, should I bring some poems? I don't really
Hmm.
know what to do with them." He said, "Yes, bring them, and just do a character. Don't try to be yourself." And I still can't tell if that was like the best advice I've ever gotten, or like sort of serious persona work in my life, which
Yeah.
is always hard to balance with reality.
I mean, I think of also like, the character that Tom Waits kind of plays in like Rumblefish and Down by Law and stuff, like those kind of Waitsian characters. I think it's important. I think persona poems in general have an important place in the genre and the canon, and I think that they can be parodied quite a bit and to sometimes to great and very funny effect. But I think it's also important to kind of step into those other skins in order
Yeah,
to be able to reorient one's perception of the world around them.
and I mean, poets have done that on the page too. Even some who maybe you wouldn't normally consider.
Absolutely. How has touring affected your writing? We talked about how some of your work feels like it's like work that's created in transit, and I do wonder about like how touring has affected it. If you feel having a more itinerant lifestyle has been beneficial for your work, or if it detracts from it at all.
I don't know that it detracts from it. I think sometimes it's hard to find a setting. It's like
Mm-hmm.
being in Europe for 3 months this past winter, which abruptly ended in a way that I wasn't expecting. I mean, it causes a shift in the writing. I mean, it's also
Mm-hmm.
just stuff that happens in life. But in that sense, I think it's taught me some things like, what it means to be a stranger in a foreign place. Or I think, I mean, I don't tour that much. I think I've
Mm-hmm.
probably been to Europe 3 times in the past 9 months. And, part of that was a plan to try to move there, and that didn't work out. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting for me. Like my notion of being there was I'm going to start writing from here, and this is going to be the thing. Of course, unforeseen things came up, and that's what it is. But I think it was difficult writing in a country where English is not the primary language spoken. I
Mm-hmm.
think it wasn't impossible, but I think my writing, I want to say it became stranger. It
Mm-hmm.
became more indescribable to me because it wasn't reflected in the world around me. And that's not to say. I mean, I was living in Denmark, where English is pretty much spoken by everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a different thing when you're surrounded by native speakers, or you're in a community where you know tons of poets and you're communicating on that level of language, which is a different thing than everyday language to begin with. But then when you bring poetic language into the context of non-native speakers, I think in some sense, it probably made me want to make my work more accessible,
Mm-hmm.
um, which wasn't. I don't think it was like I need to do this strategically. I think it was like I want to be understood where I am,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a challenge to try to get, like you said, the simplicity or there's complexity in Seattle Night Prayer, but it's also I tried to do it in. I think, yeah. What did Jack Spicer say? The ideal poet has an infinitely small vocabulary. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I kind of took that from Peter Gizzi, who was a mentor of mine at the UMass MFA in
Mm-hmm.
Amherst, who I think he writes a sort of populist poetry. Like he had this book called The Outer Nationale, which really triggered something in me. He always writes about the weather, some
Mm-hmm.
values of landscape, and weather is another one. And I think The Outer Nationale is maybe a book that came out after Some Values of Landscape and Weather, but the weather becomes music, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also sort of an outside thing
Mm-hmm.
versus
Mm-hmm.
the inside thing going inward. And I think there's an empathy in Peter Gizzi's writing that kind of comes as a result of embracing all that, almost like a Whitman-esque. But I also think, yeah, in a sense, like traveling has caused me to jot things down.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of those aphoristic writings, like the Seattle Night Prayer, I have a whole series of poems called Seattle Variations, which they figure into another collection
Mm-hmm.
of mine that's yet to come out called This Music from Another Room. And I think that title kind of relates to the feeling of being an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like being an outsider in that you're not being welcomed in, but that you're not from a place, you're not of the place, you're in the place. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when I say outsider, I mean that might be part and parcel of what it means to be a poet. It
Mm-hmm.
might be part and parcel of what it means to be neurodivergent or
Mm-hmm.
in some sense queer or so there's elements of that in the sense that when you're on the road you're in different places, which can be kind of an unsettling experience, even if
Mm-hmm.
it's sometimes exciting. And that's not to say that my travels in Denmark have all been unsettled, but there is that sense of like, especially when I was trying to live there, it opened up something in me of this kind of borderless
Mm-hmm.
notion, like, where am I from? And I think my origins have come further into relief since then, and where my
Mm-hmm.
preoccupations have
Mm-hmm.
stemmed from, like in my earlier writing up until now, and where those preoccupations are landing
Mm-hmm.
now that
Mm-hmm.
we're living in a changing world.
Yeah. That leads into my next question, which is you are both American and Swiss, and you had spent formative years in Geneva. And to your point about that kind of sense of almost like disconnection from a specific place and how dual nationalism can kind of like create a conflict within a person, I also wonder, to what extent being exposed to like a multitude of languages in a place like that where you're having not only English but French, German, Italian. There's all these variety of languages being spoken on a daily basis. How that would also influence your ear and your writing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it influenced it to an enormous degree. I moved to Geneva when I was, I want to say, 10 years old. And it was, in 95. And not only was I living in a country that has multiple national languages, which is French, Swiss German, Italian, and Romansh, which
Mm-hmm.
hardly anybody speaks, but it's there. But I was also attending the International School of Geneva, which meant that beyond that, there were dozens of other languages being spoken around me that, yes, they opened up my ears, but I think they also opened up a sense in me that my world up until then had been very small.
Mm.
It's a very international city. Like one of the UN headquarters is there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also speaking of UN, my mother's father was Dutch. Her mom
Mm.
too was Dutch, and they survived the war in occupied Amsterdam and were members of the resistance. I'm not sure what that meant exactly. I think they helped distribute newspapers and they were maybe trying to help get people out,
Mm.
but they didn't talk about it. They really didn't. But then my grandfather wound up working for UNRWA, trying
Mm.
to help Palestinian refugees find places to live. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he had a problematic relationship with that too, knowing that the colonial history there, which at the time was becoming something new.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like, okay, is this like a pipeline?
Mm-hmm.
It was all there for me, all that political stuff. And I think I'm looking back further than I used to and understanding that this is also part of things I would hear on the radio growing up or conversations that I didn't quite understand at the time. But yeah, I mean, going back to, I also lived in Amsterdam for 4 months when I
Mm.
was doing my undergrad. They were Dutch, and I tried to learn some of the Dutch language. I didn't get very far. I was only there for a short period of time, but I think like, yeah, it opened my ear, and I think it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that everything I had grown up with, which was the NBA, Magic the Gathering, skateboarding, all this stuff. It's like, you go to McDonald's like
Yeah.
every now and then, and you play Super Mario at the
Yeah.
Pizza Hut. I mean, like my world was so infinitesimally smaller than
Mm-hmm.
what it became. And I wasn't prepared for that at all. I was completely lost when I lived in Geneva. I think I was the first inkling that I was depressed. I was always very shy, but that only made me feel isolated.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into like, my middle school years. I don't think middle school is typically fun
No.
for anybody. But like, but yeah, it was just like, wow, my world is so small. And then I went back to Dayton, Ohio, and it was like,
Mm.
whoa, I can see this from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And I immediately felt I need to get out of here. I became a musician very quickly. I was playing with, I would say, mostly black musicians in Ohio
Hmm.
growing up, which was very formative too, to understand like America is not just what it looks like on TV, or
Right.
I don't know, to understand that not everybody came from the same economic background. I mean, when you're a kid, you sort of know these things, but to kind of like be confronted with it in real life situations at a young age was probably very formative and almost helpful to kind of understand, a bit of the responsibility that I had
Hmm.
playing jazz or, like a white kid from the suburbs of Dayton.
Yeah.
But then I moved to New York, and then New York was just like, wow, this is a whole other level. And then my family, none of my family lives in Ohio anymore, so
Mm.
that place became a place of memory that I haven't returned to for 20 years.
Mm.
So yeah, this sense of rootlessness is very alive in me, no
Mm.
matter where I go, and I think it's maybe not the same sense of rootlessness that a Palestinian refugee would have, but I think it allows me some solidarity or some empathy, or to understand that I don't really know where I come from, or that where I come from probably no longer looks like where I come from, or
Hmm.
and maybe that's not unique to me in any sense, but it's probably another reason I was so interested in Pound was all the languages and this idea that things were coming together. I mean, I don't
Hmm.
think I quite had my head wrapped around the fact that appropriating all these cultures into one kind of blanket overlord mentality was maybe not the way to go. But the poetry is still beautiful because it
Hmm.
has all these disparate elements. I think Charles Bernstein wrote about that in his essay Pounding Fascism.
I also think of the work of now, and he just recently passed, Jerome Rothenberg, whose omnipoetics is, he drew from so many different disciplines and genres and fused them and articulated them in so many different ways. He has such a vast amount of work, and so that kind of, I think what you allude to in your comments about relaying kind of the sense of being infinitesimal and all of a sudden realizing how vast the world is, how vast the strife is, how vast the impacts
Yeah.
of colonialism are, racism, oppression of peoples of all type, but also the incredible amount of creation and development of all these enormous arts and things in spite of these forces attempting to to oppress and
Yes.
to eliminate. It does make you really take a step back and see, especially someone like myself being cishet white guy from Southern California, how much of my cultural experience and the relevance that I seek to have through my own writing and stuff is indebted to all of these artists and the incredible scholarship and cultural work that they have done. And I would not be able to do what I do without their guidance, teaching, contribution.
Jerome Rothenberg, yeah, he was one of the first people to publish some of my poems. And we had I would say, a minimal correspondence for a while, but he was always, it just struck me that this person who seemed like such a giant figure had time to email this young poet, just trying some things
Mm-hmm.
out and showing interest. And he called my poems, they were kind of written after Paul Celan, he called them derivative. And I thought it was such a sly move because most people would think, oh, derivative is just a jab. It's just a,
Yeah.
but he said it in the sense that Robert Duncan meant it. I guess Robert Duncan wrote these derivations. And that might go a little bit against the grain of Pierre Jory saying, I don't think we should write imitations of Paul Celan.
Mm-hmm.
To put Pierre and Jerry, Jerome, Rothenberg in conversation, which they really unavoidably are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that was a process for me of trying to understand my relationship to those influences, like you were saying, like
Absolutely.
how much I'm indebted to people who suffered an inordinate amount just to put these words on page. So yeah, again, it is that feeling that the universe only grows bigger,
Yeah.
which we don't necessarily get smaller ourselves, but if we grow a little bit, it's
Yeah.
it's in proportion to this ever expanding. I won't say totality. I mean, yeah, it's
Absolutely.
pretty amazing to think of Jerry and the work that he did. I mean, he has another book coming out, Poetry of the Americas from Origins to Present, and it's like he was 94
Mm-hmm.
when he just passed away. It's just incredible that he was able to see that through.
Yes.
And I was very grateful for our short, just getting a message from him from time to
Mm-hmm.
time really made me believe that what I was doing might mean something to somebody else. Yeah.
I had the pleasure of seeing him read on 2 occasions, and I had the luxury of speaking to him for, I think, a total of 5 minutes, maybe, both him and Diane, and they were just the loveliest people in the world. He was so kind. And for someone of his stature and influence and reputation, I mean, he was just such a kind, sweet person. It's a significant loss, but there's also an immense body of work there that I think will have a continuing impact on writers and scholars. And I think it's important to go back and reread those pieces and dive into those works, and as you said, like, continue allowing us to expand as the broader universe continues to expand, so that we might be able to feel some of that expansion ourselves. I was wondering if you could read Le Orsan.
The Noursin literally means the sea urchin, and it's the name of a restaurant that a friend of mine, or really a friend's brother from Geneva, who also went to school at the International School of Geneva, started in Seattle, and I went to visit that restaurant. I don't know that the poem really relates to that, but it's a fine restaurant. They have really good food. There's a little charcuterie store. Yeah. Anyway, so this is L'Oursin. How cute you looked, counting your miseries before they were upon you. My body stretched out by the lens. Last night caught fire on a liminal level, projecting the fantasy onto the ruins of the earth. A sieve that drew down all vanity, all skullduggery and landscape in equal measure. Is it frightening in Cloud City? For this you are nothing but an empath, light's devoured surface, an attenuating glance. What we see is not what we've gotten once before, but what we could not hold on to long enough to forget.
Beautiful. For our playlist, you had requested that we add Chim Chim Cheree for Mary Poppins as played by the John Coltrane Quartet, and I just would love to hear why you selected this particular song, and also what this song, or I should say Coltrane in general, has to do with your writing. I feel like we could probably devote an entire podcast, multiple episodes of a podcast about the lasting influence of John Coltrane on writing, but
Yeah.
maybe talk about what it was about this particular song and maybe Coltrane.
Yeah, sure. I think I chose that piece after reading one of poet Nathaniel Mackey's infamous Facebook posts, where he talks about Black music in unconventionally, terminally gorgeous ways.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying something about, it was a different track. I think it was the version of My Favorite Things from Live at the Village Vanguard Again,
Mm.
which has Ferris. And it's the version of My Favorite Things where Coltrane sort of plays half a snippet of the melody and then they just go into it.
Yeah.
And it's no longer the song. And I think what Nate Mackey was writing about was how Coltrane took these naive tunes from these musicals, which, I mean, okay, like My Favorite Things, and then this one from Mary Poppins, Chim Chim Cheree, which is literally about a chimney sweep,
Mm-hmm.
and turning them into these. I mean, Chim Chim Cheree has this churning sort of brew underneath it. Dun, 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 dun,
Mm-hmm.
dun. That classic quartet with Elvin Jones and McCoy Tyner on piano and Jimmy Garrison on bass. And they just take that tune and they turn it into this. I don't know. I don't really like putting descriptors like, oh, it sounds like a swarm of locusts, or I just find it's like I don't want to turn it into some biblical fantasy here, but just this notion that they would take a song like that of this chimney sweep singing this sort of innocent song,
Mm-hmm.
which is about labor and it's about those jobs which are less desirable, or put one in a place of less status. In this musical Mary Poppins, I think it's just this notion that during the civil rights movement, things were being turned upside down. It's like James Baldwin said something like, "You will pay for it with the life that you lead."
Mm.
And so I just felt like Coltrane was blowing open the myth of white supremacy and doing it in a very genius way, but also with what felt like deep sincerity, but also oftentimes I just hear a big wide smile in his playing, and it comes down to love, and it comes down to this is what we're dealing with, and we have to love each other despite it.
Mm-hmm.
And his band was like the perfect paragon of direct democracy in action. They talked about that. These McCoy Tyner would talk about how this group had to kind of work together to understand how it was going to make music that reflected all four of its members,
Mm-hmm.
each of whom were luminaries in their own right.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hear stories of John Coltrane touring where I guess McCoy Tyner and Jimmy Garrison would fall asleep in the back of Coltrane's pickup truck, and Elvin Jones would sit in the front seat staying awake, and they would say nothing to each other and just drive to the next gig. And I think that reverence for the music and like understanding that Coltrane spent every waking hour practicing, including like between sets, there's a devotion there. Yes, again to the craft, but I think to the spiritual notion of craft. Like, what is it for? He wanted to be a force for good, and I think that's probably what I'm left with is that I forget where I read this. Probably another Facebook post because I have a lot of musician friends on there too. This is something like the music is never about the music, and I think that was one thing that was very trying for me at the conservatory, especially when I was much younger, was that it was not just about figuring out what notes you were supposed to play. I knew there was something deeper, and I think that's part of the reason that I dropped out. Not to say that you can't go to school and learn. I was very young, and I think I was a little bit unstable and probably really hungering for some kind of deeper experience of the world. So it's no discredit to my teachers, which, without whom I would not know how to do the things that I've come to learn how to do. But
Yeah.
I think there's this notion that there's something greater out there and that we're kind of looking for it. And Chim Chim Cheree is not just a turning on its head of this naive song. There's also more in there than I think it's one of the things that Coltrane would play the song Nature Boy. Like these sort of corny songs, but you can take them out.
Yeah.
I was listening to Transition the other day while I was kind of raking the lawn, and it blows something open in you when you hear that man doing what he does.
Yeah. Lastly, can you tell our listeners where to find you online, as well as where to find your latest book, On the Long Blue Night?
So, with the closure of SPD, Small Press Distribution, my book On the Long Blue Night is only available through the website of Dos Madres Press.
Mm.
If you Google Dos Madres Press, it will come up. There's a lot of other really good titles, including Refrain Series by Patrick Pritchett is a really good one. Damn by Mark Scroggins. I think Norman Finkelstein has a new one called Further Adventures. It's a cool press, and They definitely need the support. If you want to follow me, best place is probably Instagram. It's just at Eliot Cardinaux, EliotCardinaux. I do post sort of rough versions of new poems up there all the time. I just don't know how it stops.
Yeah.
And then, I have a micro press and record label where you can find some of my music, and that's called the Bodily Press. And its best place, only place, is Bandcamp. It's bodilypress.bandcamp.com. And most of the stuff I have up there is music for now. Most of my chapbooks, if you're interested in buying a chapbook from me, I can usually work something out over Instagram DMs. Yeah, that's it.
Wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Elliot, this has been a pleasure, and I hope we get to meet in person at some point and
Great.
continue this conversation. So thank you so much for your time today, and I know that our listeners will appreciate it.
Thanks so much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you to Juleen Eun Sun Johnson and Eliot Cardinaux for joining us on this episode. Please be sure to like and subscribe. If you're enjoying the podcast, leave us a review.
You can find our most recent and all past issues at brokenlensjournal.com. And as a reminder, we accept submissions year-round, so head to the website to submit your work.
Thanks to our producer, Destiny, and our theme music is composed and recorded by Art Santora. I'm Adam.
And I'm Heather.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.